April 5–10, 1943, 25,000 feet above the Belgian coast. Oberleutnant Hermann Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 observed the unfamiliar shapes moving in from the west. Large single-engine fighters unlike anything in his identification charts. His combat report, preserved in the Bundesarchiv Military Archive, documented the moment German pilots first encountered Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and battle-heavy fighters approaching at altitudes previously unreachable for American aircraft. He estimated 12 machines holding formation above 7,000 meters. What Keller saw next would disturb Luftwaffe pilots for the rest of the war. The leading American fighter suddenly flared with what looked like non-stop muzzle flash, not the quick bursts of 4 or 6 guns, but 8 synchronized streams of heavy-caliber fire, forming a converging pattern of destruction, unlike anything in German doctrine. His wingman's Focke-Wulf 190 absorbed roughly 40 hits in under 2 seconds. The aircraft didn't explode or ignite. It simply tore apart, turning into aluminum fragments under the pass. Concentrated impact of .50 caliber. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Major Donald Blakesley, of the 4th Fighter Group, had just earned the P-47's first air victory, introducing the Luftwaffe to American firepower philosophy. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts carried 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined, they delivered 6,400 rounds per minute, more than 100 bullets per second. With 350 rounds per gun, a P-47 could sustain this destructive output for nearly 33 seconds of trigger time. The arithmetic of air combat had changed entirely. This technological shock highlighted 2 opposing design theories. The Luftwaffe entered the war convinced cannon armament was the future. Their standard fighter weapon, the 20mm MG 150-120s, fired explosive shells capable of destroying an aircraft with only a few hits. German pilots trained heavily in deflection shooting, priding themselves on precision, 1 or 2 well-placed cannon shells to down an enemy. Major Günther Rall, who later became the 3rd highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, explained the German mindset in a post-war interview. We believed machine guns were outdated, that cannons were the next step in fighter armament. A skilled pilot needed only accurate placement of explosive shells. This was aerial combat as precision art. The American method reflected an industrial warfare attitude applied to the skies. Instead of relying on pinpoint accuracy, the P-47's 8-gun setup created a saturation effect. At normal combat distances of 200 to 300 yards, the convergence created an 8 by 12-foot zone of destruction in which no aircraft could survive. Colonel Robert S. Johnson, who achieved 27 victories in P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group, described the American belief. We weren't trying to fire surgical shots. We were applying overwhelming firepower. Every pull of the trigger was meant to ensure destruction through volume, not precision. The numbers showed the difference clearly. A P-47 carried 2,800 rounds, total 350 per gun across 8 guns. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 1.71 ounces. In a standard 15-second burst, a P-47 could fire more than 1,600 rounds, equal to 171 pounds of metal and incendiary material. By contrast, ABF 109G carried only 150 rounds for its single 20mm cannon, plus 2 30mm machine guns with 300 rounds each. Its ability to maintain sustained fire was far lower. A German fighter could fire its cannon for only about 6 to 7 seconds before depleting ammunition. A P-47, however, could unleash powerful bursts repeatedly during a dogfight, with enough ammunition for multiple battles. The first major contact between P-47s and German fighters had actually taken place on March 10, 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group flew the type's first combat mission over France. But that mission ended in failure due to radio problems, and all aircraft returned without engaging the enemy. The Germans remained unaware of what they had narrowly missed. What they also didn't expect was that the P-47 had been purposely engineered for high-altitude dominance. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp engine, paired with a complex turbo-supercharger system, produced 2,300 horsepower at altitudes where German engines faltered. At 25,000 feet, where B-17 bomber formations operated, the P-47 maintained performance. German fighters couldn't match. Luftwaffe emphasized fighting below 20,000 feet, where their aircraft performed best. The Bf-109G's Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, even with MW50 methanol water injection, struggled at extreme heights. The Focke-Wulf FW190A, deadly at medium altitudes, grew sluggish above 22,000 feet. Major Egenmeyer, commander of 3 JG-2 and developer of the head-on bomber attack tactic, wrote in his assessment, above 7,500 meters, the advantage shifts completely to the Thunderbolts. They maneuver easily while we fight stiff, frozen controls. They strike from above without fear, deliver their terrible firepower, and climb away safely before we can answer. By summer 1943, Republic Aviation's production capacity shocked German intelligence when accurate numbers finally reached Berlin. The Farmingdale plant, along with a new facility in Evansville, Indiana, was achieving output levels that seemed unbelievable. At peak rate, Republic produced 840 P-47s each month, 28 aircraft every day. The Evansville factory alone would eventually build 6,242 Thunderbolts. German fighter production of all types peaked at 2,177 aircraft per month in September 1944, spread across many designs. Republic's single-model output nearly equaled half of Germany's total fighter production. One American company was essentially matching the entire Reich's fighter-building capacity. OBSTLT, Joseph Priller, Geschwader Kommode of JG-26, initially dismissed intelligence reports of American output as defeatist exaggeration. After facing increasingly large P-47 formations through 1943, he reviewed those reports again and added notes. If anything, these figures seem low. We are confronting industrial warfare on a scale we never imagined. The production gap went beyond raw numbers. Each P-47 required 17,081 individual parts assembled with streamlined factory efficiency. The 8 Browning M2 machine guns alone cost more than some complete German fighters. Yet the United States would build 15,686 P-47s during the war, making it one of America's most produced fighters. On August 17, 1943, during the first Schweinfurt raid, German pilots witnessed the full capabilities of the Thunderbolt. For the first time, P-47s escorted B-17s deep into German airspace with belly tanks. JG-1 and JG-26, expecting unescorted bombers after the usual limit of Allied fighter range, instead met 240 P-47s maintaining tight escort. The battle that followed saw concentrated Thunderbolt firepower tearing through German formations. HPTM, Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland of JG-26 reported, "The Thunderbolt's guns do not simply damage aircraft, they make them vanish. We saw skilled pilots disappear in clouds of debris. No chance to bail out, no hope of survival, only instant destruction from concentrated fire." The psychological shock was immediate. German pilots who had developed careful engagement tactics now faced an enemy that erased traditional dogfighting methods. Instead of maneuvering for position, P-47 pilots could simply aim their aircraft and destroy the target through overwhelming fire. Thunderbolt. Pilots quickly refined tactics that maximized their strengths. The most feared was the high-altitude bounce, diving from 30,000 feet at nearly 500 miles per hour, firing powerful bursts, then climbing away on stored momentum. German pilots called these attacks death from above, as there was no reliable counter. The math of energy advantage heavily favored the P-47. Thunderbolt, diving from 30,000 to 15,000 feet, gained enough kinetic energy to climb back to 25,000 feet without even using full power. German fighters, already struggling to reach those heights, couldn't match this vertical control. The P-47's weight, initially viewed as a weakness, became a major advantage in diving attacks. At roughly 14,000 pounds loaded, the Thunderbolt accelerated in dives faster than any German fighter. Luftwaffe pilots attempting to escape by diving found P-47s rapidly closing the distance, firing devastating bursts during pursuit. The P-47's ammunition load created a psychological weapon beyond its numbers. With 350 rounds per gun, American pilots enjoyed tactical freedom German pilots could only dream of. They fired short bursts to adjust aim, walked streams of bullets onto targets, and engaged multiple enemies in a single mission. German pilots, with only 150 to 200 rounds for their primary cannon, lived with constant ammunition tension. Every burst required judgment. A miss meant wasting ammunition they could never replace. This imbalance created a deep psychological divide. Americans flew with abundance. Germans fought with scarcity. The production data behind this contrast was overwhelming. The Lake City Ordnance Plant in Missouri produced around 6.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war. That single factory alone could theoretically supply every P-47 ever built with over 400,000 rounds, more than 140 full combat loads per aircraft. D-Day. June 6, 1944, delivered the clearest proof of P-47 dominance. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy during the entire day. The 9th Air Force alone flew more than 2,000 P-47 sorties. German pilots arriving over the invasion beaches saw walls of American fighters beyond comprehension. The numbers were overwhelming. German pilots faced odds greater than 20 to 1. When they tried to engage, they met firepower so intense that normal dogfighting became impossible. The Luftwaffe lost 35 aircraft on D-Day. P-47s claimed 27 of them. The ground attack role added another layer to German distress. P-47s carrying bombs and rockets smashed German reinforcements heading toward Normandy. But it was the 8 guns and strafing runs that caused particular fear. A single P-47 could wipe out an entire vehicle column in one pass. Its heavy fire cutting through armor, shattering engines, and killing crews with brutal efficiency. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a combined disaster. New pilots reached frontline units with as little as 10 hours. In fighters, facing American pilots with more than 200 combat hours. The technological gap, combined with disastrous training shortages, turned battles into massacres rather than contests. German replacement pilots thrown into combat with barely any preparation faced P-47s whose 8 guns made pilot skill differences almost meaningless. Even poorly aimed bursts filled enough airspace to ensure hits. Veteran Luftwaffe instructors reported that entire training groups were wiped out in their first encounters with Thunderbolts. The numbers revealed the scale of disaster. German pilots beginning training after June 1944 had survival rates under 15% for their first 5 missions. Against P-47s in particular, survival fell below 10%. Entire squadrons vanished in single engagements, replaced by even less trained pilots who survived for even shorter periods. Operation Bodenplatte. The Luftwaffe's surprise attack on Allied airfields on January 1, 1945, showed the total collapse of German air superiority. Although achieving tactical surprise and destroying many aircraft on the ground, German losses during withdrawal were catastrophic. As German fighters turned home after their strafing runs, they encountered waves of P-47s scrambled from rear bases. Without altitude advantage or ammunition for sustained fighting, the Luftwaffe units were systematically destroyed. The 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, launching from Metz after the initial attack, intercepted German formations at low altitude and wiped out entire squadrons. The operation cost the Luftwaffe 271 aircraft and 143 pilots killed, losses they could never replace. American air combat losses totaled just 16 aircraft. The exchange ratio surpassed anything previously recorded and proved the complete superiority of American firepower, doctrine. Even the arrival of Me-262 jets offered only brief relief from P-47 dominance. Although faster in level flight, jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing. P-47 pilots developed tactics of circling near jet bases to strike during these moments. The concentrated firepower of 8 guns could destroy a jet as easily as any piston fighter if it was caught in the pattern. The jet's speed offered no protection when trapped at low altitude with landing gear extended. Several irreplaceable German jet pilots died to P-47s during these vulnerable moments, though not Walter Nowotny. He was shot down by P-51 Mustangs on November 8, 1944, not P-47s. As is sometimes incorrectly stated, the final production totals illustrated the full weight of American industrial power. Republic Aviation produced 15,686 P-47s during the war. At peak output, the factories built 840 aircraft each month. Each Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns, meaning 125,488 guns were required for the entire production run. American factories produced more than 12 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough to supply every P-47 with a virtually endless supply of combat loads. Against this, Germany built only about 33,000 fighters of all types from 1939 to 1945. Chronic ammunition shortages meant German pilots often flew with partial loads. By 1945, fuel shortages restricted missions to 15 to 20 minutes. While P-47s operated with 2 hours of fuel, the cumulative psychological strain on German pilots bordered on collective trauma. Luftwaffe medical staff documented Thunderbolt neurosis, involuntary stress reactions triggered by any sound resembling 8 synchronized machine guns. Pilots who survived multiple encounters with P-47s displayed symptoms similar to artillery shock. Veterans adopted extreme avoidance tactics aimed solely at staying alive rather than winning. They attacked only damaged or isolated aircraft, avoided combat above 20,000 feet where P-47s excelled, never attempted head-on passes against 8 guns, and disengaged immediately when Thunderbolts arrived. These were not tactics for victory, they were tactics for survival. Major Günther Rall, who survived the war with 275 victories, provided key testimony about fighting P-47s. On May 12, 1944, he lost his left thumb when attacked by P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group led by Hub Zemke. In interviews, Rall said, The P-47 could hold higher speed at altitude and dived much faster than the Bf-109. We learned to respect not only the aircraft but the firepower philosophy it embodied. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, with 104 victories, wrote in his memoirs about the psychological effect. The 8 guns of the P-47 signaled that America intended to win through overwhelming quantity rather than efficiency. Each burst communicated, "We have so much we can waste it destroying you." This message was more damaging than the physical destruction itself. Even Johann Steinhoff, who survived to become a NATO commander with 176 victories, understood the shift in air combat thinking. Though detailed quotes about P-47s are not recorded in available sources, his service with JG-26, JG-77, and JG-7 meant extensive exposure to American firepower doctrine. Beyond air combat, P-47s as ground attack aircraft inflicted separate terror on German ground forces. The 8 guns that shredded aircraft proved equally deadly against vehicles, trains, and troops. A single P-47 could disable a locomotive in one pass. Its concentrated fire punching through boiler plates that could withstand cannon shells. Veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years fighting the Soviets, broke under P-47 strafing attacks. The unmistakable roar of 8 guns firing together became the sound of certain death. Vehicle columns caught by P-47s no longer functioned as organized units, instead turning into burning wreckage stretching across miles. By early 1945, the arrival of the P-47M and P-47N widened an already impossible gap. The P-47M's Pratt & Whitney R2857C engine generated 2,800 horsepower with water injection, pushing speeds past 470 miles per hour. Only 130 P-47Ms were produced, but they represented the peak of piston engine fighter design. The K-14 computing gun sight, used on late-model Thunderbolts, erased the last German advantage deflection shooting skill. It automatically calculated lead based on range and target motion. Paired with 8 guns, this technology made even inexperienced pilots highly lethal. Germany's fuel emergency by late 1944 created a combined disaster when facing P-47s, German pilots, limited to tiny training fuel allotments, confronted Americans with hundreds of flight hours. The skill gap, combined with overwhelming technological differences, produced encounters that barely qualified as combat. German pilots constantly feared running out of fuel, weighing whether they could even engage and still return home. P-47 pilots, with plenty of fuel, could wait for their moment, climb as needed, and continue long pursuits. This fuel imbalance forced Germans into purely defensive battles while Americans controlled the initiative every time. The war's end provided clear numbers, showing the P-47's influence. In the European theater, P-47s earned 3,752 air-to-air victories, destroyed or damaged 86,000 railway cars, wrecked 9,000 locomotives, wiped out 68,000 motor vehicles, and claimed 6,000 armored vehicles. Against this, roughly 3,499 P-47s were lost to all causes, 1,020 to enemy fighters, and 2,479 to flak and operational accidents. The aerial exchange ratio was above 4-to-1, proving their dominance. The depth of German psychological trauma from P-47s became visible again during the Korean War when West German advisors worked with NATO. When shown footage of F-84 Thunderjets performing ground attack runs, several veterans displayed stress reactions, showing lingering effects of their wartime encounters. The German advisors warned NATO planners that American firepower doctrine, overwhelming volume rather than precision, had proven psychologically devastating. They advised that future enemies must understand that the United States did not seek fair fights, but rather the industrial destruction of its opposition. In April 1945, the Luftwaffe's final operational report admitted total defeat by American industrial warfare. It stated that traditional fighter combat based on skill and maneuverability had been rendered obsolete by overwhelming firepower. The P-47's 8 guns had not only shot down German aircraft, they had crushed an entire combat philosophy. German pilots had entered the war as knights of the air, believing in precision and individual talent. They ended it realizing that modern warfare belonged to nations able to mass-produce unstoppable firepower. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8.50 caliber guns, had delivered this lesson. Post-war analysis by military historians supports the P-47's major impact on air warfare. The 8-gun setup represented more than just firepower. It symbolized American industrial thinking applied to combat. Where Germans valued efficiency and careful shooting, Americans relied on overwhelming abundance. Dr. Williamson Murray, in his study of the air war, noted, the P-47's 8 guns democratized air combat. Individual skill became less important than industrial strength. German aces with hundreds of hours found themselves equal to American novices when facing walls of .50 caliber fire. The psychological effect spread beyond individual pilots to German military doctrine. The Wehrmacht had pioneered combined arms strategy, but American industrial power symbolized by the P-47's raw firepower showed that production capacity outweighed tactical creativity. The manufacturing history of the P-47 illustrates the size of America's industrial mobilization. Republic Aviation grew from a small company, producing 39 aircraft in 1939, to building 840 every month by 1944. This single firm's expansion surpassed the entire increase in German aircraft production. The Evansville plant, built on empty ground in 1942, employed 28,000 workers at its peak, 40% of them women. Many had no industrial background, yet they built fighters so reliable that losses from mechanical failures were minimal. Each P-47 contained 305,000 rivets, installed with pneumatic tools that most German factories didn't even have. Assembly line efficiency meant American workers completed major sections in hours that took days in German facilities. This productivity converted directly into overwhelming numbers in European skies. The ammunition network supporting P-47 operations demonstrated American logistical dominance. Beyond the 6.5 billion rounds produced at Lake City, plants in St. Louis, Denver, and Salt Lake City manufactured billions more. This ammunition abundance ensured P-47 pilots never experienced the ammunition fear that tormented German flyers. American logistics delivered ammunition worldwide, guaranteeing that P-47 units never lacked supplies. Forward airfields in France received daily ammunition shipments larger than what German units received in an entire month. This logistical superiority ensured every P-47 sortie launched fully armed, while German fighters increasingly took off with partial loads. America's pilot training program also sustained a steady flow of qualified Thunderbolt pilots. By 1944, the United States was training 100,000 pilots a year, with dedicated programs for P-47 operations. These pilots reached combat units with more than 200 flight hours, including over 50 in the P-47. German pilot training collapsed from 250 hours before the war to fewer than 50 hours by 1944. Fuel shortages meant many German pilots fired their guns for the first time in actual combat. This training gap, combined with the P-47's overwhelming firepower, created encounters that resembled executions rather than fights. The P-47's influence extended far beyond wartime statistics. Its 8-gun philosophy shaped American doctrine throughout the Cold War. The focus on overwhelming firepower rather than precise efficiency became a defining feature of U.S. military thinking. German officers who later joined NATO brought harsh lessons learned from facing American firepower. They stressed that the P-47's 8 guns had shown them modern war was ultimately about industrial strength. Nations able to mass-produce overwhelming force would defeat those relying on superior individual skill. Pilot survival rates revealed the air war's fundamental inequality. American P-47 pilots who completed their tours had survival rates around 90%. German fighter pilots facing P-47s had survival rates under 30% from 1944 to 1945. This contrast did not reflect bravery or talent. It reflected the stark math of confronting overwhelming firepower. Young German pilots, some with fewer than 10 hours in fighters, faced American veterans with hundreds of combat hours flying aircraft armed with 8 heavy machine guns. The outcome was determined by industrial numbers, not personal ability. The Luftwaffe's fighter corps was not simply defeated, it was systematically erased. The P-47's strategic effect reached far beyond individual battles. It helped secure air superiority over Europe. Thunderbolts enabled the bomber offensive that crippled German industry, protected the bombers that destroyed fuel plants, and contributed to the very shortages that paralyzed the Luftwaffe. Even more importantly, P-47 ground attack missions halted German movement across the front. The Wehrmacht's inability to travel in daylight without suffering heavy P-47 strafing changed operational possibilities entirely. The Normandy campaign partly succeeded because German reinforcements could not move through skies dominated by Thund-era Bolts. In post-war German military culture, the P-47 became a symbol of American material strength. Veterans used the phrase Thunderbolt mentality to describe the application of overwhelming force. German military education stressed that future wars required matching American industrial power, not simply improving tactics. The term 8 guns entered the vocabulary as shorthand for unbeatable firepower. Staff colleges studied how traditional martial excellence meant little against industrial-scale firepower. The P-47 taught German officers that modern war was economic rather than heroic. German pilots were shocked when P-47 Thunderbolts cut apart their fighters with 8.50 caliber guns. But their shock reflected a deeper misunderstanding of modern conflict. They had believed in quality over quantity, skill over mass production, precision over saturation. The P-47 taught them through brutal experience that industrial democracy's ability to mass-produce overwhelming firepower outmatched totalitarian efficiency. Every encounter with those 8 guns reinforced one truth. America had transformed warfare from individual combat into industrial processing. The 15,686 P-47s built, the 125,488 machine guns they carried, and the billions of rounds supplied represented more than military capability. They embodied a production philosophy capable of equipping every fighter with double the necessary firepower simply because industrial abundance made it possible. German pilots learned this lesson painfully through daily encounters with American fighters that could destroy them completely. Repeatedly, almost effortlessly, the 8 guns of the P-47 did more than secure air superiority over Europe. They proved that in the era of industrial warfare, the nation with the greatest production power would always prevail. The German pilot's shock at facing P-47s was, in the end, shock at discovering the real nature of modern war. They had prepared for heroic duels and instead faced an industrial machine that process them with 8 guns firing more than 100 rounds per second. In those converging streams of tracers lay the entire story of World War II America's ability to produce overwhelming force and deliver it anywhere. The German pilots who survived eventually understood they had fought not just superior aircraft, but a superior production system. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8.50 caliber guns, had been democracy's answer to totalitarianism, not through ideology, but through industrial mathematics no skill or bravery could overcome. In the end, German shock turned to comprehension. They had encountered the future of warfare, and it had 8 guns delivering American industrial supremacy one devastating burst at a time.